You know, there are moments in history that don't make it into textbooks. Moments so intimate, so scandalous, so deeply human that they get buried beneath the weight of propriety and shame. Tonight, I want to tell you about one of those moments, a story that begins with desire, unfolds through betrayal, and ends with a single piece of paper that would destroy everything. Picture this. It's a warm evening in 1855, somewhere in the heart of Virginia. The kind of night where the air hangs heavy with humidity and the scent of magnolia blossoms drifts through open windows. Inside a grand plantation house, the kind with white columns and sprawling verandas, a woman sits at her writing desk. Her name is Catherine Ashford, though history would later try very hard to forget she ever existed. The candlelight flickers across her face, casting shadows that make her expression impossible to read. In her trembling hands, she holds a letter. Just a few lines, nothing more. But those lines contain the power to unravel her entire world. You see, this letter wasn't meant for her. It was addressed to her husband, Edmund, and what it revealed would shatter not just a marriage, but an entire hidden world that existed in the shadows of plantation life. A world where the lines between master and slave, between propriety and passion, between friendship and possession, became so blurred that when the truth finally emerged, no one would escape unscathed. The letter was simple, written in an unpracticed hand with spelling errors and ink blots, but its message was devastating. Master Edmund, there are things happening in your house that you should know about. Your wife has been unfaithful with Samuel, and she has shared him with Mrs. Pritchard. Catherine's breath came in short gasps as she read those words again and again, as if repetition might change their meaning. How had this happened? Who had written this? And more importantly, what would Edmund do when he read it? Because make no mistake, he would read it. It was only a matter of time. The letter had been placed on his desk, tucked carefully beneath his ledger book where he would find it when he sat down to review the plantation's accounts. Someone in this house had betrayed her, someone who knew her secret, someone who had watched and waited and finally decided to act. The realization made Catherine's skin crawl. She thought back over the past months, trying to remember who might have seen something, who might have guessed. The house had so many servants, so many eyes watching from corners and doorways. She'd been careful, or so she thought, but clearly not careful enough. Outside her window, she could hear the distant sounds of evening on the plantation. The quarters where the enslaved people lived were settling down for the night. Somewhere, a woman was singing a low, mournful song. The cicadas had begun their nightly chorus, and in the stables, horses shifted and snorted in their stalls. Everything seemed normal, ordinary, but Catherine knew that this normalcy was about to explode into chaos. Her hands were still shaking as she set the letter down on her desk. She needed to think, needed to plan, but her mind felt like it was moving through molasses, slow and thick and unable to form coherent thoughts. The panic was setting in, that cold dread that starts in your stomach and spreads outward until your entire body feels numb. Think, Catherine, think. What were her options? She could destroy the letter, pretend she'd never seen it, but Edmund would simply write it off as misplaced, and whoever had written it might write another. She could confront Edmund directly, try to explain before he read the accusations. But explain what? How could she possibly justify what she'd done? How could he make him understand the loneliness that had driven her to seek comfort in forbidden places? No. There was no explanation that would satisfy him, no words that would make this acceptable in his eyes or in the eyes of their society. She could run, take Samuel and disappear into the night, flee north to freedom. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was fantasy. A white Southern woman didn't just run away with an enslaved man. They'd be caught within days. The consequences would be unthinkable, not just for her, but especially for Samuel. He would be the one to suffer most. Catherine stood and walked to her window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. The moon was rising, full and bright, casting silver light across the plantation grounds. Somewhere out there, in the servants' quarters, Samuel was probably preparing for bed.
Did he know about the letter? Had he seen something that made him suspicious? Or was he going about his evening completely unaware that his entire life was about to change? The thought of Samuel being sold away, sent to some distant plantation where she'd never see him again, made Catherine's chest tighten with an emotion she didn't want to name. It wasn't supposed to be like this. What had started as a way to fill the emptiness in her marriage had become something else entirely, something complicated and dangerous, and, if she was honest with herself, something that she hadn't been able to control. And then there was Annabelle, her closest friend, her co-conspirator in this impossible situation. What would happen to her when the truth came out? Would Charles divorce her? Would she be cast out of society? The scandal would destroy both their families, spread like wildfire through their social circle, become the whispered topic at every gathering for years to come. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to remember how it had all begun. When had the first line been crossed? When had glances become touches, touches become something more? It had happened so gradually that she couldn't pinpoint a single moment when everything changed. That was the dangerous thing about secrets. They started small, almost innocent, and grew until they consumed everything. Now here she was, standing in her bedroom in the middle of the night, holding evidence of her own destruction and unable to see any way forward that didn't end in disaster. The candlelight behind her flickered, casting her shadow long and distorted across the wall. And in that moment, Catherine Ashford realized something that would define everything that came next. She was trapped. Trapped by the society she'd been born into, trapped by the choices she'd made, trapped by the letter that sat on her desk like a ticking bomb. All she could do now was wait for the explosion and hope that somehow, when the dust settled, there would be something left to salvage from the ruins.
But to understand how Catherine Ashford arrived at this impossible moment, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when she was just Catherine Whitmore, a young woman of 18, standing in her family's parlor in Charleston, being introduced to Edmund Ashford for the first time. Imagine for a second what it meant to be a wealthy woman in the antebellum South. Your life was prescribed from the moment you were born. You were to be graceful, obedient, pious, and above all, marriageable. You attended the right schools, where you learned French and piano and needlepoint. You went to the right balls, where you smiled at the right men and said the right things. You were groomed, quite literally, to be ornamental, a beautiful object that would reflect well on your family and eventually on your husband. Catherine had been good at playing this role. She was beautiful in that strong-featured way that wasn't quite fashionable but was undeniably striking. Dark hair that she wore in elaborate arrangements, eyes that were almost black, penetrating and intelligent in a way that sometimes made people uncomfortable. A mouth that could smile charmingly when required, but more often settled into a thoughtful, almost stern expression. Her family was old Charleston money, not the wealthiest, but respectable, connected. Her father owned a modest rice plantation and had investments in shipping. Her mother had died when Catherine was 12, leaving her to be raised by a series of aunts who did their best to mold her into the perfect Southern lady. And Catherine had complied, mostly. She'd learned to play the piano beautifully. She could discuss literature and current events without seeming too opinionated. She knew how to manage servants and plan dinner parties. She was, by all measures, exactly what she was supposed to be. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior, Catherine had always felt something else, a restlessness, a hunger for something more than the prescribed life that awaited her. She would sit in her room at night and wonder what it would be like to make her own choices, to live a life that wasn't dictated by social expectations and family obligations, to be seen as something more than just a pretty ornament in someone else's house. Of course, she never spoke these thoughts aloud. Young women who questioned their place in society were quickly labeled as difficult or unstable. So Catherine learned to keep her thoughts to herself, to smile when expected, and to wait for whatever life would bring her next. What life brought her was Edmund Ashford. He was 33 years old when they met, recently widowed, with a thriving tobacco plantation in Virginia. His first wife had died in childbirth along with their baby,
a tragedy that had left him somber and withdrawn. But he was ready to marry again. He needed an heir, needed someone to manage his household, needed the social legitimacy that came with having a wife. Catherine's father saw an excellent opportunity. The Ashfords were wealthier than the Whitmores, owned more land, had better connections. A marriage between Catherine and Edmund would elevate the entire Whitmore family. So the arrangement was made, as these things were. There was a brief courtship period where Edmund visited Charleston several times, took Catherine for chaperoned walks, sat stiffly in the Whitmore parlor making polite conversation. He was not unkind, not warm either, but not cruel. He spoke to Catherine about his plantation, about his plans for expanding his tobacco operations, about the house he was building. He asked her opinion on trivial matters: what color should the dining room be painted, what flowers should be planted in the garden. Catherine understood that these questions were a formality. Her opinions would be considered and then likely ignored, but she appreciated the gesture nonetheless. They were married in the spring of 1849. Catherine was 18, Edmund was 33. The wedding was everything it should have been: elaborate, expensive, attended by everyone who mattered in Charleston society. Catherine wore white silk and carried orange blossoms. Edmund looked distinguished in his formal wear. They spoke their vows in the church where Catherine had been baptized, surrounded by flowers and candlelight and the approving smiles of family and friends. And then it was done. Catherine Whitmore became Catherine Ashford, and her old life ended as her new one began. The journey from Charleston to Edmund's plantation in Virginia took 4 days. Catherine sat in the carriage, watching the landscape change, feeling like she was traveling to another world, and in a way she was. Edmund's plantation, which he called Ashford Hall, was impressive. The main house was 3 stories of white-painted brick, with tall columns and wide verandas on every floor. There were formal gardens, stables, a separate kitchen building, quarters for the house slaves, and beyond that, rows and rows of tobacco fields stretching to the horizon. It was beautiful in that carefully manicured way that hid all the ugliness underneath. Catherine was given a tour by the housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Hendricks, who'd managed the household since Edmund's mother's death decades earlier. She was shown her rooms, a bedroom and sitting room decorated in pale blues and cream, furniture that had belonged to Edmund's first wife, windows that looked out over the gardens. The master expects dinner at 6. He takes his breakfast at 7 and prefers not to be disturbed in his study during the afternoon. The accounts are reviewed every Friday. You'll need to approve the weekly menu by Monday morning, and the master does not permit the servants to be idle. If you see anyone not engaged in useful work, you are to report it immediately. Catherine nodded, taking in this list of rules and expectations. This was to be her life now: managing this house, producing an heir, maintaining appearances. She unpacked her trunks, arranged her belongings in her new rooms, and tried not to think about how trapped she already felt. That night she lay awake in Edmund's bed, the bed that had belonged to her first wife, and wondered what she had gotten herself into. Edmund was not cruel in their intimate moments, but he was not gentle either. He approached the marriage bed in the same business-like efficiency he applied to everything else in his life. It was a duty to be performed, nothing more. Afterward, he would return to his own adjoining bedroom, leaving Catherine alone in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all there would ever be.
The first year of Catherine's marriage passed in a blur of adjusting to her new role. She learned the routines of the household, the expectations of her position, the delicate social dance required of a plantation mistress. She managed the house slaves, planned menus, organized dinner parties for Edmund's business associates, and attended church every Sunday, where she sat in the Ashford family pew and listened to sermons about duty and obedience and knowing one's place in God's grand design. It was exactly the life she'd been trained for, and she'd discovered that she was good at it. The household ran smoothly under her management. The dinner parties were successful. Edmund's associates praised him on his choice of wife. She was pretty enough to be ornamental, but competent enough to be useful. But Catherine was desperately unhappy, though she barely admitted this even to herself. The loneliness was crushing.
Edmund was kind in a distant sort of way, but he had no interest in her as a person. He never asked about her thoughts or feelings. Their conversations were limited to household matters and social obligations. He maintained separate bedrooms, visiting hers occasionally when he decided it was time to try for an heir, then retreating immediately afterward. There was no intimacy, no companionship, no sense that they were building a life together. They were simply two people living in the same house, fulfilling their socially prescribed roles. Catherine tried to fill the emptiness in acceptable ways. She threw herself into managing the household with even greater efficiency. She started a garden where she spent hours arranging flowers and planning elaborate landscaping. She read voraciously, ordering books from Richmond and Charleston, losing herself in novels and poetry and travel narratives about places she would never see. She learned to paint watercolors, setting up an easel in her sitting room where she would spend entire afternoons capturing the view from her window. And she cultivated her friendship with Annabelle Pritchard, the one bright spot in her otherwise monotonous existence. Annabelle had married Charles Pritchard the same year Catherine married Edmund. The two women had known each other since childhood, had attended the same finishing school, had made their debuts in the same season. When Catherine moved to Virginia, she was delighted to discover that Annabelle lived less than 10 miles away. The two women quickly established a routine of regular visits, alternating between their respective plantations, taking tea together, going for walks, sharing the small intimacies that women's friendships allowed. Annabelle understood Catherine in a way that no one else did. She, too, was trapped in a loveless marriage. Charles was a banker, successful and respectable, but utterly boring. He cared only about money and social position, had no interest in books or art or anything beyond his business dealings. Annabelle and Catherine would sit together and speak in careful code about their disappointments, never quite saying outright that they were unhappy, but understanding each other perfectly nonetheless. It was during one of these visits, about 2 years into Catherine's marriage, that something shifted. They were sitting in Catherine's garden on a warm afternoon in May. The roses were in full bloom, their scent heavy in the air. Catherine was embroidering while Annabelle read aloud from a novel they'd both been enjoying. And then Annabelle stopped mid-sentence and said, "Do you ever wonder if this is all there is? If we're supposed to just accept that this is our lives now, forever, until we die?" Catherine looked up from her embroidery, surprised by the directness of the question. They usually danced around such topics, never quite stating their dissatisfaction so plainly. "I try not to wonder. Wondering seems dangerous." "But you do wonder. I know you do. I can see it in your eyes sometimes, Catherine. That look like you're somewhere else entirely, like you're imagining a different life." Catherine set down her embroidery, her hands suddenly trembling slightly. "What good does imagining do? We are what we are. We can't change it." "Can't we?" Annabelle asked softly. "Are we really so powerless? We manage entire households. We control dozens of servants. We plan events and manage budgets and make decisions that affect everyone around us. And yet we're supposed to believe we have no power over our own lives?" This conversation marked a turning point, though Catherine didn't realize it at the time. It was the first crack in the facade of acceptance she'd built around herself, the first acknowledgement that the restlessness she felt wasn't shameful or wrong, but shared by someone else, someone she trusted. In the months that followed, Catherine found herself thinking more and more about Annabelle's words, about power and powerlessness, about the strange contradiction of being simultaneously in control and completely controlled. She began to pay attention to the small ways in which she did have power. The house servants deferred to her wishes. When she walked through a room, conversations stopped. People moved aside for her, waited for her approval, sought her favor. She was mistress of this plantation in every meaningful sense except the legal one. And gradually, slowly, Catherine began to wonder if there might be ways to exercise that power that went beyond managing menus and planning dinner parties. She began to notice things she'd previously overlooked. The way the male house servants would glance at her when they thought she wasn't looking, the way they would find excuses to be in whatever room she occupied, the way they responded when she spoke to them directly, with a kind of attentiveness that went beyond simple obedience. She noticed Samuel in particular. He was young, only 23, and had been trained as a house servant from childhood. He was tall and well-built, with intelligent eyes and hands that moved with surprising grace when he served tea or arranged flowers. Edmund had purchased him 3 years earlier, specifically for housework, recognizing that Samuel had a natural aptitude for the refined tasks required in the main house. Samuel was quiet, efficient, and seemed to anticipate needs before they were spoken. Catherine found herself requesting his presence more and more often. She needed help rearranging furniture in her sitting room. She wanted his opinion on where to place a new painting. She required assistance carrying books from the library. These were tasks that any servant could have performed, but Catherine specifically asked for Samuel, and Samuel, understanding the implicit nature of these requests, always complied. Their interactions began to change, almost imperceptibly at first. A conversation that lasted slightly longer than necessary, a moment where their hands touched as he handed her something, a look that held for just a beat too long. Catherine told herself she was simply being friendly, that she was treating Samuel with the kindness that any good Christian mistress should show her servants. But deep down she knew it was something else, something dangerous, something that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't since her wedding day. And when she lay awake at night in her empty bed, she found herself thinking about Samuel in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. This is how it began, not with a grand passion or a moment of overwhelming desire, but with small accumulations, a touch here, a glance there, a growing awareness that filled the emptiness inside her with something warm and dangerous and completely forbidden.
The exact moment when the relationship between Catherine and Samuel crossed from appropriate to inappropriate is impossible to pinpoint. There was no single instance, no clear line that was consciously crossed. Instead, it was a gradual progression, each small step seeming innocent enough on its own, but together forming a path that led somewhere neither of them could have anticipated. It started with conversations. Catherine would be working on her embroidery in the parlor, and Samuel would be polishing silver nearby. She would comment on the weather, or mention a passage from a book she was reading, and Samuel would respond. At first, his responses were brief, appropriate, "Yes, ma'am," or "That sounds interesting, ma'am." But gradually, as Catherine continued to engage him, his answers became more substantive. He revealed that he could read, having been taught by Edmund's mother years ago when such education for enslaved people was still occasionally permitted in Virginia. He had opinions about the books Catherine mentioned, thoughts about the world beyond the plantation. Catherine found herself looking forward to these conversations. Samuel's perspective was different from anything she encountered in her usual social circles. He was thoughtful, articulate, and possessed an understanding of human nature that came from years of careful observation. In the rigid hierarchy of the plantation, enslaved people learned to read the moods and motivations of their masters as a survival skill. Samuel had become expert at it. As summer turned to fall in that 3rd year of Catherine's marriage, the nature of their interactions continued to evolve. Catherine began to confide in Samuel in ways she hadn't with anyone else. She spoke about her loneliness, about the emptiness of her marriage, about feeling trapped in a life that had been chosen for her. Samuel listened, rarely offering advice, but providing something perhaps more valuable, genuine attention. He saw her not as the mistress of the plantation or as Edmund Ashford's wife, but as Catherine, a person with thoughts and feelings and desires that went unacknowledged by everyone else in her world. For Samuel, these conversations were complex and dangerous. He understood the power dynamics at play, understood that any interaction with Catherine could end in disaster for him. An enslaved man who became too familiar with his mistress could be beaten, sold, or worse. But he also recognized an opportunity. Intimacy with Catherine provided protection. As long as she valued him, found him useful and interesting, he was safe from the brutal labor of the tobacco fields.
He would remain in the relative comfort of the house, would be spared the worst degradations that other enslaved people endured. So Samuel navigated carefully, offering enough of himself to maintain Catherine's interest while trying to protect himself emotionally from the impossible situation he was in. The first physical contact that went beyond accidental brushing of hands happened on a cool October evening. Edmund was away on business, traveling to Richmond to meet with tobacco brokers. Catherine had dined alone and was sitting in the parlor, reading by lamplight. Samuel came in to bank the fire for the evening. As he knelt by the fireplace, Catherine set down her book and watched him work. The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong lines of his jaw, the concentration in his eyes as he arranged the logs. "Samuel," she said quietly, and he turned to look at her. "Yes, ma'am." "Are you happy here, in this house?" It was an absurd question, and they both knew it. Happiness wasn't something enslaved people were permitted to pursue or even discuss. But Samuel considered his answer carefully. "I'm grateful for my position, ma'am. I know it could be much worse." "That's not what I asked," Catherine pressed. "I asked if you're happy." Samuel stood, brushing ash from his hands. "I'm not sure I know what happiness would look like, ma'am. I've never been free to find out." The honesty of this response hit Catherine hard. Here she was, complaining about her loveless marriage and her prescribed life, speaking to a man who had never known freedom at all. The gulf between their situations was enormous, and yet there was something shared between them too. A sense of being trapped, of having lives determined by others, of craving something more. "I'm sorry," Catherine said softly. "I shouldn't have asked such a thoughtless question." "You weren't thoughtless, ma'am," Samuel replied, and there was something in his voice that made Catherine look up at him. "You were honest. That's rare." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition. And then Samuel broke eye contact, as he had to because that was the rule. Enslaved people did not stare at white people, especially not white women. "Will that be all, ma'am?" "Yes," Catherine whispered. "Thank you, Samuel." He left the room, and Catherine sat in the firelight, her heart pounding. She told herself nothing had happened, they had simply had a conversation, but she knew that wasn't entirely true. Something had shifted, some boundary had been tested, and the world felt different now. Over the following weeks, these moments multiplied. Catherine would touch Samuel's arm when asking him to do something. She would stand close to him, closer than necessary, when he was helping her with some task. She would hold his gaze for just a beat too long. And Samuel, reading these signals with the careful attention that survival required, began to respond in kind. A hand that lingered when he took something from her, a smile that was slightly warmer than servile politeness required, a presence in whatever room she occupied that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. Edmund, focused on his tobacco business and seemingly indifferent to his wife's daily activities, noticed nothing. The other servants noticed, of course, they always did, but house slaves learned early not to speak of what they observed in the private lives of their masters. Such knowledge was dangerous. Better to see nothing, say nothing, and hope to avoid being drawn into whatever drama was unfolding. The actual physical affair began on a December night, 3 weeks before Christmas. Edmund had retired early with a headache. The house was quiet. Catherine had dismissed most of the servants for the evening. She sat in her sitting room, ostensibly reviewing household accounts, but really just waiting. For what? She couldn't quite admit to herself. When Samuel knocked softly on her door carrying fresh firewood, she knew it wasn't coincidence. "Come in," she called, and when he entered, she stood and walked towards him. "Close the door," she said softly. Samuel hesitated, understanding that closing that door would change everything. But he did it. Because what choice did he have? And because, despite everything, despite the impossible power dynamics and the danger and the moral complexity, there was something real between them, some connection that transcended the brutal reality of their circumstances. What happened next happened quietly, tentatively, both of them aware that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. Catherine reached out and touched Samuel's face, and he didn't pull away. Their first kiss was gentle, almost questioning, as if asking permission that the law said Samuel could never actually give. And then the questioning turned to certainty, and the careful distance they'd maintained collapsed entirely. This is how Catherine Ashford began an affair with an enslaved man in her household, not through force or coercion in the obvious sense, but through a gradual progression of small transgressions that accumulated into something undeniable. And from that night forward, everything in the Ashford household would be different, even if no one except them two knew it yet.
The months that followed were perhaps the happiest Catherine had ever known, though happiness built on such a foundation was inherently fragile. She and Samuel developed a careful routine, finding stolen moments when Edmund was occupied elsewhere, when the house was quiet, when the risk of discovery seemed minimal. Catherine became expert at creating legitimate reasons for Samuel's presence in her rooms. He brought firewood, delivered correspondence, helped rearrange furniture, watered the plants in her sitting room. Tasks that could take 5 minutes were stretched to 30. Doors were locked from the inside, curtains were drawn, and in those precious, dangerous interludes, Catherine felt truly alive for the first time in her adult life. She was careful, obsessively so. She varied the times and locations of their meetings. She never showed Samuel any public favoritism that might draw attention. She maintained her distant, appropriate demeanor whenever anyone else was present. And Samuel, understanding that his life depended on this discretion, was equally careful. They never spoke of what was happening between them when others might overhear. They developed subtle signals. A particular book placed on a table meant it was safe to meet that evening. A handkerchief left on a chair meant Edmund would be away the next afternoon. But despite all their precautions, secrets in plantation houses were nearly impossible to keep. Too many people moved through too many spaces. Enslaved house servants had access to every room, heard every conversation, observed every interaction. They knew which marriages were happy and which were facades. They knew about affairs and debts and family conflicts. They were invisible to white people only because white people chose not to see them, but they saw everything. Martha, the senior house slave who had practically raised Catherine since her arrival at the plantation, almost certainly knew something was happening. She would give Catherine long, measuring looks sometimes, as if trying to decide whether to speak. But she said nothing, at least not directly. Instead, she made subtle comments. The master was asking after Samuel this morning, wondering where he was. Or, Mrs. Henderson mentioned she thought our household was running particularly smoothly lately. I told her it's because everyone knows their place and keeps to it. These comments were warnings, Catherine understood, gentle reminders that she was being watched, that discretion was essential, that the consequences of discovery would be catastrophic. Catherine took these warnings seriously, but she couldn't bring herself to end the affair. For the first time in years, she felt seen, understood, desired. Samuel listened to her thoughts about books and politics and philosophy. He noticed when she was sad and asked what was wrong. He touched her with a tenderness that Edmund had never shown. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being valued as a person rather than as a possession or ornament. And Samuel, what did he feel? This is where the historical record becomes frustratingly opaque. We have Catherine's diary entries, written in careful code but still revealing her emotions. We have letters she wrote but never sent, found among her papers after her death. But Samuel's voice is largely absent. We can only infer his feelings from his actions and from the few second-hand accounts that mention him. Some historians argue that Samuel was simply surviving, making the best of an impossible situation by aligning himself with someone who could protect him. Others suggest that genuine affection developed, that within the constraints of slavery, Samuel found ways to exercise agency and choice. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Human emotions are rarely simple, and the emotions that develop in situations of extreme power imbalance are even more complex. Samuel likely felt a mixture of things: gratitude for the relative safety his relationship with Catherine provided, affection for her genuine kindness toward him, resentment at the fundamental unfairness of his position, and perhaps even love, though love that develops in such circumstances is always complicated by the question of whether true consent is possible. What we do know is that Samuel was careful to maintain his usefulness to Catherine. He would share observations about the other servants, about Edmund's moods, about which neighbors were gossiping about what. He positioned himself as her ally and confidant, someone she needed not just for physical intimacy, but for information and support.
This was survival strategy as much as relationship maintenance. The affair had been going on for about 8 months when Annabelle Pritchard visited one warm spring afternoon in 1854. Catherine and Annabelle sat in the garden, as they often did, drinking lemonade and discussing the various social events they were expected to attend. But that day, Annabelle seemed distracted, melancholy even. "What's wrong?" Catherine finally asked, setting down her glass. Annabelle was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Do you remember last summer when you told me you sometimes wonder if this is all there is? If we're supposed to accept that our lives will be nothing but managing households and attending church and growing old in loveless marriages?" "Of course I remember," Catherine replied, carefully. "I think about it all the time," Annabelle continued, "and I keep coming back to the same question. Why shouldn't we have something for ourselves? Why should we be the only ones required to be faithful and dutiful and self-sacrificing while our husbands do as they please?" This was dangerous territory, and Catherine knew it. But there was something in Annabelle's voice, a kind of desperate hunger, that made Catherine pause. "What are you saying, Belle?" Annabelle looked at her directly. "I'm saying I see how you've changed this past year. You're happier, lighter somehow. And I've wondered what caused that change. At first I thought maybe you and Edmund had reconciled, but I know that's not it. You barely mention him anymore except in the most perfunctory ways." Catherine's heart began to race. How much had Annabelle guessed? "I've simply learned to find contentment in small things, books and gardening, and Samuel?" Annabelle interrupted softly. The world seemed to stop. Catherine stared at her friend, unable to speak, her mind racing through denials and explanations and calculations about how much Annabelle actually knew versus how much she was guessing. "Don't worry," Annabelle said quickly. "I haven't told anyone. I would never. But Catherine, I have eyes. I see how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. I see how you find reasons for him to be near you. And I'm not judging, truly. I'm envious." This admission hung in the air between them. Catherine could deny everything, could shut down this conversation and retreat behind proper outrage at such an accusation. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was loneliness, the loneliness of keeping this enormous secret entirely to herself. Or perhaps it was the recognition that Annabelle was offering something rare, understanding without judgment. "It's not what you think," Catherine finally said, though even as she spoke she knew how inadequate that statement was. "Isn't it?" Annabelle asked gently. "And would it matter if it was? Catherine, we're trapped in these marriages, in these lives. If you found some way to make it bearable, some source of happiness, however unconventional, I say more power to you." They talked for over an hour after that, Catherine gradually revealing more of the truth, Annabelle listening with a mixture of fascination and longing. And by the end of that conversation, something fundamental had shifted in their friendship. They were no longer just two plantation wives passing time together. They were co-conspirators, bound by a secret that could destroy them both if revealed. "I wish," Annabelle said as she prepared to leave that afternoon, "I wish I had your courage." And there it was, the seed that would grow into something neither of them could have predicted. The idea that what Catherine had found could be shared, that Annabelle might find similar comfort, that their friendship could extend into this new, forbidden territory. Catherine said nothing in response that day, but the idea had been planted, and over the following weeks it grew in her mind. Why shouldn't Annabelle have what she had? They were friends, after all. They shared everything else in their lives, and there was a certain appeal to having a true partner in this transgression, someone who understood not just intellectually, but experientially what it meant to cross this particular line. It would be several more weeks before Catherine would make the offer that would change everything, but the foundation had been laid in that garden conversation, in Annabelle's admission of envy, and Catherine's recognition that her friend was as trapped and lonely as she had been. And once that foundation existed, it was perhaps inevitable that the house built upon it would eventually collapse.
The decision to involve Annabelle in her relationship with Samuel wasn't something Catherine made impulsively. She thought about it for weeks, turning the idea over in her mind like a puzzle she was trying to solve. On one hand, the risk seemed enormous. Adding another person to the secret tripled the chances of discovery. But on the other hand, there were potential benefits. If Annabelle were equally compromised, equally vulnerable to scandal, she would have even more reason to protect their secret. They would be bound together in a way that went beyond ordinary friendship. And perhaps most importantly, Catherine had to admit to herself she was lonely. Even with Samuel, there was a fundamental isolation to what she was doing. Samuel couldn't truly be a confidant about the relationship itself. The power dynamics made that impossible. He couldn't advise her or share her fears or celebrate the joy of what they'd found. But Annabelle could. Annabelle could understand in a way no one else could what it meant to be a southern white woman transgressing every rule of society. So one Tuesday afternoon in late June, when Annabelle came for her regular visit, Catherine made her proposition. They were sitting in Catherine's private sitting room, the door closed, supposedly reviewing plans for an upcoming church social. Instead, Catherine set down the papers and looked at her friend directly. "Belle, do you remember what you said about wishing you had my courage?" Annabelle looked up, immediately alert to the seriousness in Catherine's tone. "Of course. What if you could? What if I could help you find what I've found?" Catherine watched her friend's face carefully as understanding dawned. Annabelle's eyes widened slightly. "Catherine, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Catherine said slowly, "that we're friends, true friends, and friends share things, don't they? The burden of this secret has been enormous. Carrying it alone has been terrifying. But with you, with someone I trust, someone who understands, it could be different. We could help each other, protect each other." Annabelle stood and walked to the window, her back to Catherine. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're talking about Samuel." "Yes." "Catherine, I don't know what to say. This is impossible, scandalous, wrong," Catherine supplied. "All of those things, yes, but also potentially liberating. You said yourself that you're trapped in your marriage just as I am in mine. Charles barely acknowledges your existence except when he needs you to hostess some dinner for his business associates. You've told me yourself that your bedroom is a place of duty and discomfort. Don't you deserve something more? Don't you deserve to feel alive?" The conversation that followed was long and circular, Annabelle raising objections and Catherine addressing them, both women dancing around what was really being discussed, the moral implications, the practical dangers, the sheer audacity of the idea. But underneath all the objections, there was interest. Catherine could see it in the way Annabelle kept returning to the subject, even when she claimed to be refusing. Could see it in the questions she asked. What was it like? How it had started? How did they avoid being caught? Finally, after nearly an hour, Annabelle turned from the window and looked at Catherine directly. "If I were to consider this, and I'm not saying I am, but if I were, how would it even work? Carefully, very carefully. You would visit, as you already do. Samuel would be present for perfectly legitimate reasons, serving tea, helping with some household task. We would create opportunities for you to speak with him privately, to get to know him, and then we would see what develops naturally." "Naturally?" Annabelle laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "There's nothing natural about any of this." "No," Catherine agreed, "but that doesn't mean it can't happen. And Belle, I think it would be good for both of us to not be alone in this." This last admission was perhaps the most honest thing Catherine had said. She wasn't just offering Annabelle access to Samuel, she was asking for companionship in her transgression, for someone who could understand and share the complex emotions, the guilt, the fear, the exhilaration that came with breaking every rule of their society. Annabelle was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I need to think about this. I need time." "Of course," Catherine agreed. "Take all the time you need. But Belle, don't speak of this to anyone. Not even if you decide against it. Some secrets are too dangerous to share." Annabelle nodded, gathered her things, and left shortly after. Catherine watched her friend's carriage disappear down the long drive and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But a week later, Annabelle returned. She arrived without prior notice, her face pale but determined. "I've thought about your offer," she said as soon as they were alone, "and my answer is yes. But Catherine, we need to be extraordinarily careful. The consequences if we're caught—" "I know," Catherine interrupted. "Believe me, I know. We'll be careful, I promise." And so began what was perhaps the strangest arrangement in the already strange dynamics of the Ashford plantation. Over the next several weeks, Catherine engineered increasingly frequent encounters between Annabelle and Samuel.
At first, they were brief and awkward, Samuel bringing tea while Annabelle was visiting, the three of them making stilted small talk while trying to pretend this was normal. Samuel, for his part, understood what was being asked of him with a mixture of resignation and strategic thinking. Another white woman to please meant more protection, but also more danger. If either of these women turned against him, if their arrangement fell apart and he became the scapegoat, he would have no defense. But refusing wasn't really an option. So Samuel played his part, engaging Annabelle in conversation, responding to her tentative overtures with careful politeness. Gradually, the awkwardness faded. Annabelle began to visit more frequently, timing her arrivals for when she knew Edmund would be occupied elsewhere. She and Catherine would spend time together, and Samuel would be present, and slowly the three of them developed a strange kind of ease with each other. They would talk about books, about politics, about plantation life. Samuel would share observations that made both women laugh or think. Annabelle began to relax around him, to see him not just as a slave, but as a person with thoughts and feelings and surprising intelligence. The first time Annabelle and Samuel were alone together, truly alone, in a guest bedroom while Catherine kept watch, Annabelle was so nervous she could barely speak. But Samuel, experienced now in navigating these impossible situations, was patient. He let Annabelle set the pace, responding to her cues, making her feel less like she was doing something wrong and more like she was claiming something that should have been hers all along. Afterwards, Annabelle sat with Catherine in the garden, and she wept, not from regret, but from relief, from the release of years of pent-up longing and loneliness. "Thank you," she whispered to Catherine. "Thank you for understanding, for not judging, for this." Catherine held her friend's hand and felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in having helped Annabelle, in having shared this gift. There was relief in no longer being alone with her secret. But there was also, if she was honest with herself, a small seed of something else. Jealousy, perhaps, or possessiveness. Samuel was hers alone, and now he wasn't. She told herself this was foolish. Samuel wasn't hers to possess. He wasn't anyone's by right, even if the law said otherwise. But feelings aren't always rational, and Catherine found herself watching the interactions between Samuel and Annabelle with more attention than she wanted to admit. Still, for several months, the arrangement worked. Catherine and Annabelle were closer than ever, bound by their shared secret. Samuel remained protected and valued in the household. Edmund noticed nothing amiss. The household continued to function smoothly. It was an impossible situation that somehow, improbably, seemed to be succeeding. But of course, nothing so unstable could last forever. The cracks were already forming, even if no one could see them yet.
For the first few months after Annabelle became part of the arrangement, everything seemed to work remarkably well. The three of them, Catherine, Annabelle, and Samuel, found a rhythm that accommodated everyone's needs while maintaining the appearance of propriety. Annabelle would visit 2 or 3 times a week, always with some plausible excuse. She and Catherine needed to plan some social event or review dress patterns or discuss a book they were both reading. Edmund, when he was home, barely noticed. He was preoccupied with plantation business and his own pursuits. The visits were unremarkable to him, just the normal social exchanges between wives of wealthy planters. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, dynamics were shifting in ways that none of them fully recognized at first. Annabelle, who had initially been tentative and almost apologetic in her interactions with Samuel, grew more confident. She began to assert herself, to make requests, to expect certain attentions. What had started as Catherine's generous offer to share something precious began to feel, at least to Catherine, like something else entirely. Like Annabelle was claiming equal ownership of something that Catherine still thought of as fundamentally hers. This possessiveness was deeply uncomfortable for Catherine to acknowledge. After all, what right did she have to feel possessive of Samuel? He wasn't hers in any real sense. Their relationship was built on a foundation of slavery, of absolute power imbalance. She had no moral ground to stand on when it came to claiming exclusive access to him. And yet, human emotions don't follow moral logic. Catherine found herself feeling jealous when Annabelle monopolized Samuel's attention during visits. She felt irritated when Annabelle would suggest meeting times without consulting her first. She noticed with growing discomfort how Annabelle's eyes would track Samuel's movements whenever he was in the room.
Annabelle, for her part, seemed oblivious to Catherine's discomfort at first. She was caught up in her own emotional awakening, experiencing for the first time in her marriage something that felt like genuine connection. She began to take risks that Catherine thought were dangerous. She would arrive unannounced, hoping to catch Samuel alone. She would linger after Catherine had signaled it was time for her to leave. She started bringing small gifts, a book she thought Samuel would enjoy, a particularly good apple from her orchard, a new shirt she claimed to have ordered by mistake for Charles that just happened to fit Samuel perfectly. These gifts troubled Catherine for multiple reasons. First, they increased the risk of discovery. Any of the household servants might notice and wonder why Mrs. Pritchard was bringing gifts for a slave. Second, they represented a kind of claim staking that made Catherine uneasy. But most troubling of all, they suggested that Annabelle's feelings for Samuel were deepening beyond what was safe or sustainable. One afternoon in late autumn, the tension finally surfaced. Annabelle had visited and spent an unusually long time alone with Samuel, while Catherine entertained another guest in the parlor. When the other guest left and Catherine went to find Annabelle, she discovered her still in the library with Samuel, sitting unusually close, speaking in whispered tones that stopped abruptly when Catherine entered. "Belle, your carriage has been waiting for quite some time," Catherine said, her voice cooler than she intended. "Mrs. Henderson will wonder what's keeping you." Annabelle stood reluctantly, smoothing her skirts. "I lost track of time. Samuel and I were having the most fascinating discussion about the architecture of the house." It was a weak excuse, and all three of them knew it. Samuel, sensing the tension, excused himself quickly and left the room. As soon as he was gone, Annabelle turned to Catherine with an expression that was part defiant, part guilty. "You're angry with me." "I'm not angry," Catherine replied, though even as she said it, it wasn't entirely true. "I'm concerned. You're taking too many risks, Belle, staying too long, arriving unannounced. People will notice." "People?" challenged Annabelle. "Or you? Are you concerned about discovery, Catherine, or are you concerned that I'm intruding on something you want to keep for yourself?" The bluntness of this question caught Catherine off guard. "That's not fair. I invited you into this arrangement because I value our friendship, because I wanted to help you find what I'd found, but that doesn't mean we can be careless." "I know that," Annabelle said, but her tone suggested she was only partially convinced. I didn't expect to feel this way. I thought it would be simple, physical, but Samuel he's remarkable, Catherine. Surely you see that. He's intelligent and kind and enslaved," Catherine interrupted. "Whatever we feel, whatever connection we think we have with him, we can never forget that fundamental fact. He has no choice in any of this, Belle. We are the ones with power, and we're using that power in ways that are morally indefensible, even if they make us happy." This speech was remarkable coming from Catherine, because it suggested she was finally acknowledging what she'd been avoiding confronting for months, the moral bankruptcy at the heart of their arrangement. But Annabelle heard it differently. To her, it sounded like Catherine was trying to assert dominance, to remind Annabelle that ultimately Samuel belonged to the Ashford household and therefore to Catherine. "So what are you saying angrily? That I should be grateful for whatever access you choose to grant me? That I should remember my place in this hierarchy you've created?" "That's not what I meant," Catherine began. "Isn't it? Catherine, you can't have it both ways. Either we're friends sharing this experience as equals, or you're the generous mistress allowing me limited access to your property. Which is it?" The conversation deteriorated from there, both women saying things they would later regret, both feeling hurt and misunderstood. Annabelle left in anger, and Catherine was left standing in her library, shaking with a combination of fury and fear. She'd known on some level that adding Annabelle to the situation would complicate things, but she hadn't anticipated this feeling of losing control, of watching the careful balance she'd maintained spiral into something chaotic. That evening, Catherine did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She went to Samuel's small room in the servants' quarters. This was dangerous. Her presence there could be noticed by other servants, but she needed to talk to him outside the main house, outside the roles they had to play when others might be watching. Samuel was surprised to see her, immediately concerned. "Ma'am, is something wrong? Should I come to the house?" "No," Catherine interrupted, closing the door behind her. "I needed to talk to you here, privately." She sat on the edge of his narrow bed, suddenly unsure how to begin. How could she explain the jealousy and possessiveness she felt when she had no right to either emotion? How could she ask him about his feelings when his position meant he could never be fully honest with her? "Samuel, I need you to ask me something, and I need you to be truthful with me if you can. Samuel sat in the room's only chair, maintaining careful distance. "Of course, ma'am. Do you have feelings for Mrs. Pritchard? Real feelings, I mean." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his response. Finally, he said, "With respect, ma'am, I'm not sure how to answer that question. My feelings don't particularly matter, do they? Mrs. Pritchard is a kind woman who treats me with more respect than I have any right to expect. So if you're asking whether I prefer her company to other situations I might find myself in, then yes. But if you're asking something else, something about choice and desire and things I'm not free to have opinions about, then I don't know what to tell you." It was the most direct Samuel had ever been with her, and she realized he was carefully not answering her real question. "Do you prefer her to me? Do you wish I hadn't involved her? Do you understand that I'm jealous?" "She's becoming attached to you," Catherine said instead, "more attached than is safe for any of us. I'm worried about what will happen if she continues down this path." "And you're not attached, ma'am?" Samuel asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. Of course she was attached. That was the whole problem. But admitting it felt dangerous, felt like acknowledging something that could never be fully real given the circumstances. "That's different," Catherine finally said, though she wasn't sure why or how. "Is it?" Samuel challenged gently. "You brought Annabelle into this because you were lonely, because carrying the secret alone was too hard. But now that she's here, you're realizing that sharing means giving up some control, and you don't like that, because control is what you have. It's what all of this is built on." The truth of his words stung. Catherine stood, suddenly needing to leave, to escape this uncomfortable honesty. "Just be careful with her, Samuel. Don't encourage her to take risks that could expose all of us." She left before he could respond, hurrying back to the main house through the darkness, aware that having this conversation had probably been a risk in itself. And she was right to be worried, because Martha had seen her, had watched from her own window as the mistress of the house slipped into Samuel's quarters and emerged 20 minutes later looking agitated. Martha said nothing that night, but she filed the observation away, adding it to all the other things she'd noticed over the past year. The fabric of secrets in the Ashford household was growing threadbare, and Martha was beginning to wonder if it was her responsibility to mend it before everything tore apart completely.
Martha had been part of the Ashford household for 42 years. She'd been born on the plantation, daughter to the cook and a field worker, and had been brought into the main house at age 7 to begin training as a house servant. She'd seen 3 generations of Ashfords live and die in this house. She'd helped raise Edmund from a boy, had attended his first wedding, had mourned with him when that young wife died in childbirth. When Catherine arrived as Edmund's second wife, Martha had been assigned to help her adjust to her new role, teaching her the routines of the household, introducing her to the other servants, showing her how things were done in the Ashford house. Over the years, Martha had become as close to Catherine as an enslaved woman could be to her mistress, which is to say, not close at all in the ways that mattered, but intimate with the details of her daily life. Martha knew Catherine's moods, her preferences, her secrets. Or at least, she'd thought she knew the secrets. The affair with Samuel hadn't come as a complete shock to Martha. She'd seen this pattern before, though not in the Ashford house specifically. In 42 years of service, she'd witnessed the full range of human behavior in plantation households. She knew about masters who kept enslaved women as mistresses, about illicit affairs between house servants, about the quiet desperation that drove people to seek comfort wherever they could find it. What did surprise Martha was Catherine's decision to involve Annabelle Pritchard. That seemed reckless, dangerous in a way that the original affair wasn't. 2 white women sharing an enslaved man? The potential for disaster was exponential. Martha had wrestled with what to do about her knowledge for months. Her first instinct had been to say nothing, to let the white folks' drama play out however it would. That was the safest course for someone in her position. See everything, say nothing, survive by staying invisible. But as the situation continued, as she watched the risks mount and the tensions grow, Martha began to feel a sense of responsibility that troubled her. This was her household too, in a way. She'd spent her entire life here. Her daughter worked in the kitchen, her son in the stables. Her grandchildren had been born on this plantation. If scandal erupted, if the Ashford household collapsed in disgrace, what would happen to all of them? Would they be sold? Separated? Sent to new masters who might be crueler?
The stability of the Ashford plantation had protected Martha's family for decades. Edmund was not a kind master, but he wasn't exceptionally cruel either by the standards of the time. He fed his enslaved people adequately, didn't beat them without cause, sometimes even allowed families to stay together. If Edmund's reputation was destroyed, if the plantation had to be sold or divided, Martha's family would be at risk. So Martha began to consider whether she had a duty to act, not out of loyalty to Edmund specifically, but out of self-interest. Protecting the stability of the household meant protecting her own family. There was also, if Martha was honest with herself, an element of personal feeling involved. She'd watched Catherine for 6 years now, had seen her arrive as a frightened young bride and gradually develop into the mistress of the house. Martha had felt something almost maternal toward her, this young white woman who seemed so lost in her prescribed role. But that sympathy had limits. Catherine's actions endangered everyone, and she seemed oblivious to the consequences for anyone but herself. The decision to write the letter came after Martha witnessed the argument between Catherine and Annabelle in the library, followed by Catherine's late-night visit to Samuel's quarters. It was clear to Martha that the situation was escalating, that the careful balance that had kept things hidden was beginning to collapse. She had perhaps 2 options: do nothing and hope the situation resolved itself, or intervene in a way that might preserve the household's stability. The question was how to intervene. She could speak directly to Catherine, warn her that the risks were too great, but that might backfire. Catherine might fire her or sell her family out of anger and fear. She could speak to Samuel, try to convince him to end the affairs. But Samuel had even less power than she did, and putting that burden on him seemed unfair. Or she could tell Edmund, let the master of the house deal with his own household's problems. Let him make the decisions about how to handle this situation. If Edmund knew, he could end the affairs, could impose discipline, could restore order. And most importantly, he could do it in a way that might avoid public scandal. If the truth came out through gossip or discovery from outsiders, the scandal would be enormous. But if Edmund learned about it privately, he could manage it quietly. The decision made, Martha still struggled with how to communicate what she knew. She couldn't simply walk up to Edmund and tell him his wife was being unfaithful. The social hierarchy didn't allow for such direct confrontation. And she needed to protect herself, needed some deniability in case Edmund reacted unpredictably. The solution was a letter. Martha couldn't write well. Enslaved people in Virginia were forbidden to learn to read and write, though some did anyway in secret. Martha had picked up bits of literacy over the years, enough to write simple messages, though her spelling was imperfect and her handwriting shaky. She found paper in the household supplies, used a stub of pencil, and carefully composed her message on an evening in early March when the house was quiet. Master Edmund, there are things happening in your house that you should know about. Your wife has been unfaithful, with Samuel, and she has shared him with Mrs. Pritchard. I tell you this not from malice, but from duty. What you do with this information is your decision. I remain your faithful servant, M. She read it over several times, checking for mistakes, making sure it said enough to be clear, but not so much that it revealed more than Edmund needed to know. She didn't describe specific incidents or provide detailed accusations, just the essential facts. Then came the question of delivery. She couldn't hand it directly to Edmund, that would make her involvement too obvious, so she waited for an afternoon when Edmund was out inspecting the tobacco fields, went into his study, and tucked the letter partially under his ledger book on his desk, a place that he would find when he sat down to work, but not immediately upon entering the room. A place that suggested the letter had been there for a short while, not just left moments ago. After placing the letter, Martha felt an immediate sense of relief mixed with dread. Relief that she'd done something to address the crisis brewing in the household. Dread about what Edmund's response would be and how it would affect everyone involved. She went about her duties for the rest of that day with unusual nervousness, jumping at every sound, wondering if Edmund had found the letter yet, what he would do when he read it. That evening, she watched Edmund carefully. He came in from the fields, washed up, went to his study. Martha busied herself nearby, folding linens in the hallway where she could observe without being obvious. She saw Edmund enter his study and close the door. 20 minutes passed, 30, and then Edmund emerged,
his face composed but pale, a muscle working in his jaw. He walked past Martha without speaking, went to his bedroom, and didn't come out for the rest of the evening. He didn't confront Catherine that night, didn't summon Samuel, didn't rage or shout, just withdrew into silence. And that silence was somehow more frightening than any explosion of anger would have been. Martha lay awake in her small bed that night, listening to the sounds of the house settling, wondering what she'd set in motion. Had she done the right thing, or had she just made everything worse? Would Edmund handle this with restraint, or would his response be violent? Would people she cared about be hurt because of what she'd done? These questions would haunt Martha for weeks to come, and the answers, when they finally arrived, would be more complicated than she had imagined.
Edmund Ashford was not a man given to emotional outbursts. He'd been raised in the tradition of Southern gentlemen, to maintain composure, to think strategically, to never reveal weakness or loss of control. So when he found the letter tucked beneath his ledger book on that March afternoon, his first reaction was not rage, but a kind of cold shock that spread through his chest like ice water. He read the words once, then again, then a third time, as if repetition might change their meaning. Your wife has been unfaithful with Samuel, and she has shared him with Mrs. Pritchard. The implications were staggering. Not just that Catherine had taken a lover. Edmund could have weathered that scandal, as distasteful as it was. Affairs happened, even among respectable people. They could be managed quietly, resolved behind closed doors. But Catherine had chosen an enslaved man. That was different. That was a violation of the entire social order that Edmund's world was built upon. White women were supposed to be pure, untouchable, above the base desires that supposedly characterized lesser races. They were the moral centers of Southern households, the guardians of civilization. If white women could prefer black men to their own husbands, then what did that say about white supremacy? What did that say about the natural order that justified keeping human beings in bondage? And then there was the second part. Catherine had shared Samuel with Annabelle Pritchard. Two wealthy white women, pillars of their community, had conspired to carry on this arrangement together. The scandal would be nuclear if it became public. It would destroy not just the Ashford name, but the entire social circle they moved in. Charles Pritchard would be humiliated. The church would be scandalized. Every plantation within 50 miles would be gossiping about it for generations. Edmund sat at his desk for a long time, the letter in his hands, his mind working through the possibilities. His first impulse was to storm into Catherine's rooms and confront her immediately, to drag Samuel out and have him whipped or sold, to write to Charles Pritchard and expose Annabelle's participation. But Edmund hadn't built a successful plantation by acting on impulse. He'd succeeded through careful planning, through thinking several moves ahead, through controlling his emotions and making strategic decisions. So he forced himself to think rationally about this situation. What were his actual goals here? Revenge? Justice? Preserving his reputation? Ending the affairs? Each of these goals required different approaches, and some were incompatible with others. If he wanted revenge, he could destroy everyone involved, sell Samuel to the most brutal plantation he could find, divorce Catherine and expose her publicly, ruin Annabelle's reputation throughout Virginia society. But revenge would also destroy his own reputation. He would be the cuckold, the man who couldn't control his own wife, who'd been betrayed by his own property. The humiliation would follow him forever. If he wanted to preserve his reputation, he needed to handle this quietly. No public accusations, no dramatic confrontations, just quiet resolutions that stopped the affairs without revealing why they'd needed to be stopped. But how could he do that without seeming weak, without giving Catherine and Annabelle the impression that they could transgress without consequences? Edmund realized he needed more information before he could make a decision. He needed to verify what the letter claimed, to see for himself whether this was truth or malicious gossip. He needed to understand the full extent of the situation before determining how to respond.
So for the next 2 weeks, Edmund watched. He paid attention to things he'd previously ignored. He observed Catherine's interactions with Samuel, looking for signs of familiarity or intimacy. He noted when Annabelle visited and how long she stayed. He tracked Samuel's movements through the house, which rooms he entered and when. And gradually he began to see what had been invisible to him before. The way Catherine's hand would linger on Samuel's arm when he served her tea, the way Samuel would find reasons to be in whatever room Catherine occupied, the frequency of Annabelle's visits, and the fact that Samuel was almost always present during them, the subtle glances exchanged when they thought no one was watching. It was all there once Edmund knew to look for it. The pattern was unmistakable. The letter had been telling the truth. Now Edmund had to decide what to do about it.
He considered his options carefully, weighing each one against his goals and values. He could sell Samuel immediately, send him so far away that Catherine would never see him again. That would certainly end the affair, but it might also provoke Catherine to leave or to create a scandal by protesting too strongly. He could divorce Catherine, but divorce was enormously scandalous in itself and would raise questions about why. People would speculate, and the truth might come out anyway. He could confront Catherine privately and demand she end the affair, but what leverage did he have to ensure she complied? She might simply become more careful about hiding it. He could expose Annabelle to her husband Charles, creating an ally in managing the situation, but that risked Charles reacting unpredictably, perhaps with violence or public accusations that would make everything worse. After much deliberation, Edmund decided on a strategy that was characteristically calculating. He would demonstrate his knowledge and power without making explicit accusations. He would make it clear that he could destroy everyone involved if he chose to, but that he was willing to show restraint if they complied with his unspoken demands. The key was to reassert control without creating a public scandal, to end the affairs by making the participants too afraid to continue them, and he knew exactly how to do it. He would host a dinner party, invite Annabelle and Charles, and during that dinner he would casually mention his intention to sell Samuel. He wouldn't need to say more than that. The threat would be clear to everyone who mattered, and the consequences of defiance would be equally clear. It was a perfect strategy, subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability, but unmistakable in its message. Edmund felt a grim satisfaction as he planned the details. He would show these women that they had no power here, that their little rebellion had been observed and would be crushed without mercy if they didn't submit. He would remind them of the fundamental truth of their world. He was the master. They were subject to his will, and Samuel was property that could be disposed of at any moment. But even as he made these plans, Edmund felt something he hadn't expected, a kind of weariness. He was tired of the games, tired of the pretense, tired of maintaining a marriage that had never been based on genuine affection. Part of him wanted to simply end it all, sell the plantation, leave Virginia, start fresh somewhere else where he wasn't bound by all these suffocating social expectations. But he couldn't do that. His entire identity was tied up in being a successful Virginia planter, in maintaining his position in society, in upholding the traditions and hierarchies that defined his world. To walk away would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that the system itself was broken. So Edmund pushed aside his weariness and focused on the task at hand. He would reassert control. He would end this situation on his terms, and he would ensure that everyone involved understood the consequences of transgressing against the natural order. The dinner party was scheduled for the following Thursday. Edmund personally wrote the invitation to the Pritchards, his handwriting perfectly composed, his tone cordial. Just a friendly dinner between neighbors, nothing unusual. Catherine would have no reason to suspect anything was wrong until the moment Edmund revealed his hand, and by then it would be too late for any of them to do anything but submit.
So here we are, at the end of this story. A story about desire and betrayal, about power and powerlessness, about people trying to find human connection within a system designed to deny humanity itself. You might be wondering what the point of all this was. Why tell this particular story? Why spend so much time on the private dramas of people who've been dead for well over a century? And the answer is this. Because stories like this one reveal truths about our history that we often prefer to ignore. We like our history simple. We want clear heroes and villains, obvious moral lessons, stories that make us feel good about how far we've come. But real history is messy and complicated. Real people are neither purely good nor purely evil. They're complex, contradictory, human. Catherine Ashford was a victim of the patriarchal society she was born into, trapped in a loveless marriage, denied autonomy and self-determination. But she was also a victimizer, using her power over an enslaved man for her own gratification, bringing her friend into a situation that put everyone at risk. Both things are true. Both matter. Annabelle sought connection and meaning in a life that offered her little of either, but she also participated in a system of exploitation, seeing Samuel as a means to her own fulfillment, rather than as a person with his own rights and needs. Again, both things are true. Edmund was a calculating man who controlled his household with strategic precision, but he also chose a path of relative restraint when he could have chosen violence. He was a product of his time and culture, believing genuinely in the system of slavery, yet capable of recognizing intelligence and capability even in people that system defined as property. Complex, contradictory, human. Martha made a choice that destroyed other people's happiness because she believed it was necessary to protect her own family and preserve household stability. Was she a betrayer or a protector? The answer depends on your perspective, and both perspectives have validity. And Samuel was enslaved, denied every fundamental human right, treated as property to be owned and used. But within those terrible constraints, he exercised what agency he could. He made choices, developed strategies, maintained his humanity despite a system designed to strip it from him. He was simultaneously victim and survivor, powerless and resourceful, hurt by what happened but not destroyed by it. These are the kinds of truths that don't fit neatly into simple narratives, but they're important truths nonetheless. Because if we pretend that history was simple, that evil was always obvious and good always clear, we fail to learn the lessons history has to teach us. Slavery wasn't just about obviously cruel masters whipping obviously suffering slaves. It was also about systems of control that corrupted everyone they touched, that made otherwise decent people complicit in atrocity, that created situations where human connection became impossible because fundamental power imbalances poisoned every interaction. Slavery made victims of the enslaved, obviously and primarily, but it also made victims and victimizers of white women who had some power over enslaved people, but almost none over their own lives. It created a society where genuine relationships across racial lines were impossible because the power dynamics were too extreme. It damaged everyone, though obviously not equally or in the same ways. This is why the story of Catherine, Samuel, and Annabelle matters, not because their particular drama was historically significant in any grand sense. It wasn't. Not because they were particularly important people. They weren't. But because their story illuminates these larger truths about what slavery was and what it did to everyone involved. And here's the uncomfortable part. We can't simply dismiss this story as ancient history, as something that happened so long ago it has no relevance to our present moment. Because the fundamental dynamics this story reveals, power imbalances, systems of exploitation, the ways people use and hurt each other while telling themselves comforting lies, the difficulty of achieving genuine connection across lines of structural inequality, these things didn't end with slavery's abolition. They persist, in different forms, in different contexts, but with similar underlying patterns. When we hear stories today about exploitation in various forms, about people using their power over others for personal gratification, about systems that deny full humanity to some people while elevating others, about the ways privilege can blind us to our own complicity in injustice, we're seeing echoes of the same dynamics that played out in the Ashford Plantation in 1855.
So what's the lesson here? What are we supposed to take away from this painful, complicated story? I think the lesson is this. We need to tell the truth about history, even when that truth is uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. We need to acknowledge the full humanity of everyone involved, victims and victimizers alike, without using that acknowledgement to excuse the inexcusable. We need to recognize that good people can do terrible things when they're shaped by terrible systems, and that this recognition doesn't absolve them of responsibility, but does help us understand how to build better systems in the future. We need to remember that behind every historical statistic, every abstract discussion of slavery or the antebellum South, there were real people living real lives, experiencing real pain and real joy and real complexity. They weren't characters in a simple morality play. They were humans trying to survive and find meaning in circumstances that were often impossible. And perhaps most importantly, we need to listen for the voices that history tried to silence. Samuel's voice barely survives in the historical record. Martha's disappears entirely. Countless other enslaved people whose stories were never recorded, whose experiences were never documented, whose humanity was denied by the very systems that should have preserved their memories. When we tell stories like this one, we're engaged in an act of remembrance and resistance. We're saying that these lives mattered, that these stories deserve to be told, that the people who lived them deserve to be recognized as fully human even when their own time denied them that recognition. Catherine Ashford, Samuel, Annabelle Pritchard, Edmund Ashford, Martha. These were real people, or people very much like them. They lived in a world that was morally broken, and they made choices within that world, some brave, some cowardly, some kind, some cruel. They hurt each other and helped each other, often simultaneously. They were shaped by their circumstances, but also exercised choice within those circumstances. They were, in short, human as we are, with all the capacity for both good and evil that implies. Their story is part of our story, part of the long, complicated, often painful narrative of how we got from there to here. And if we're willing to really listen to that story, to sit with its discomfort, to resist the urge to simplify it into something more palatable, it has much to teach us about power, about justice, about the ongoing work of building a world where everyone's full humanity is recognized and honored. This is why we tell these stories. This is why we dig into archives and piece together fragments of lives long ended. This is why we spend time with the uncomfortable truths of our past. Not to judge the dead, though judgment is sometimes necessary. Not to feel superior to our ancestors, though we should learn from their mistakes, but to understand, to remember, to honor the full, messy, complicated humanity of everyone who came before us, and in doing so, to better understand ourselves and the world we're still building together. Thank you for staying with this story, for sitting with its discomfort, for honoring these lives by bearing witness to them. May we all have the courage to face history honestly and the wisdom to learn from what it has to teach us.